Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2. Over the last week or so, I've had access to a review version of the Vessel of Hatred expansion, and I've been blasting the ever-living crap out of Spiritborn, and today I just wanted to show you guys what the best leveling build is so you can just annihilate the game. One of the best parts about this build is that it is very low gear requirement, and it is super insane, and you can, probably one of the best leveling builds I've ever played with, and you can bring it all the way into the end game, which is actually the end game build that I ended up setting up and just completely decimating everything with. I'll probably make a separate video for the endgame guide, so feel free to stick around and check that out on the channel. Probably post that pretty soon, so feel free to subscribe. But yeah, this build, as you can see in the gameplay, it is a ridiculous amount of fun. It'll completely carry you through the leveling process. Very, very mobile, does crazy damage, pretty good survivability if you spec into it, and in the end game, it gets absolutely insane. You kind of just play the same thing, but it is taken to the nth degree, and it is really, really fun. I'm also going to be posting a ton of other videos relating to the expansion, so if you guys just want a generic leveling guide, highly recommend checking that video out. And also, like I said, more Spiritborn related content, and I'm just pumping out a ton of videos anyways, so definitely feel free to check out the channel for more stuff like that if you're interested. Real quick, I want to mention that I'm going to be streaming a ton over on Twitch, so definitely make sure to check me out if you have any questions relating to Spiritborn, or just in general you want to come hang out, see me blast on Spiritborn, and see kind of what an endgame version of the build looks like. Feel free to come check me out, twitch.tv/Nick2. There's going to be Twitch drops, so you can get a ton of cosmetics if you guys are interested in those sorts of things. And if you're so inclined, you could gift 2 Twitch subs to get a nice little mount here. And if you get 4 subs, you get nice little armor for the mount. So would greatly appreciate that. Helps make it sure that I can continue to create content for a living. If you find the content helpful, definitely make sure to check me out over on Twitch, and I would appreciate it a ton. Getting into the build itself, I want to mention that some things are subject to change because the version of the game I'm playing right now is not the version that we're going to be playing at launch. Some things are subject to change, such as balance. Maybe there's some bugs that are in the game right now that are going to get patched out, etc. But as always, the entirety of the build will be posted over on Mobilytics. So if anything does change, it will be posted here, and I'll just make an updated video as well, and I'll make sure to leave it down in the comments. Currently, I haven't fleshed it out, but I would highly, highly recommend checking out the build link in the description. One of the best things about this is for leveling, you can just select leveling path in the skill tree, and you can just scroll down here and go in the exact order that I go in, and I'll have all of the legendaries, everything out planned here for you, so you don't have to worry about it. Because Spiritborn is a brand new class, I'm going to go extremely in depth and explain all the decisions behind all the skills, etc. So if you just want a very quick rundown, just check the build link. Otherwise, I'm going to get into some depth here. I would recommend watching it so you kind of understand how it works and what you're looking for, and also how to carry the build into the end game, because I'm going to go over all that stuff. But without further ado, let's just get into it. So first off, what is the build actually going to be using? I've tried a ton of the core skills. Honestly, I really wanted Rake to be good. I started out with Stinger. I've tried almost every skill on this class, and for leveling and even in the end game, Quill Volley, for most intents and purposes other than like Thorns or Pure Poison, etc., for just doing raw damage and just as a skill itself, Quill Volley is kind of a step above almost everything else. It starts out really, really good. I'll kind of just show it to you guys real quick. It's basically like Bone Spear. As you can see, it looks very similar to Bone Spear. And then there's a legendary where this one, the feathers explode at their apex, so when it reaches the end of the cast, it'll explode, and then as it comes back, it explodes again, and it makes the Quill Volley come back. Without the legendary, it doesn't actually ricochet backwards, so this basically just enables it to do a ton of additional damage. And then the modifiers for it are it just makes enemies vulnerable for free, and then also you throw 3 additional feathers, so you throw 8 as opposed to 5, just doing more damage, and it increases damage per enemy hit. So for the purposes of leveling, Quill Volley definitely seems to be our best option. It's possible that it ends up getting nerfed, but I don't think it would be anywhere near nerfed to where it just wouldn't be usable or anything. So that is what we're going to go for. Obviously, though, we need a basic skill. There's multiple reasons to actually use different basic skills. First off, I would just simply recommend against Withering Fist, unless you're playing like a poison build or something like that, or you want some damage reduction. For leveling, we use a basic skill, and then eventually we take it off because you don't need it. Early on, I quite like Thrash. The benefit of Thrash is that it has pretty high attack speed, but also you get this extra vigor generation where after killing an enemy, your next one generates 10 additional vigor, and it stacks up to 10 casts. So if you just kill 10 enemies, every single time you go to Thrash, one time you get 18 vigor, which is really good. Another benefit of Thrash is that the third attack is going to always give you a stack of Ferocity, and early on you don't have access to Ferocity. Ferocity is just going to give you increased attack speed per stack, and because early on you don't have a lot of Vigor generation, you're regularly going to be pressing Thrash. Thrash also does pretty good damage relative to the other basic skills, so early on I would recommend it. There's some inherent synergies with Thunderspike and this being an Eagle build. Talk more about the Eagle specialty later and how it synergizes with evading. But Thunderspike has this cool little thing where the third attack is always going to hit further, and it does extra damage, and it is going to reduce your evade cooldown instantly. You don't really need this evade cooldown reduction unless you play a pure evade build. As long as you have some evade cooldown reduction boots, which again we'll talk about later, your evade is going to be perfectly fine. And then Thunderspike does, on average, generate you 14 vigor, whereas Thrash is going to give you about 18. And then you have this, again, extra little thing here where when you evade, you attack with Thunderspike, making enemies vulnerable. You don't really need the vulnerable application there because Quill Volley is already going to make enemies vulnerable. The basic skill, like, this is kind of preferential, to be honest. If you want more of an evade playstyle, you can go with Thunderspike, but generally, I would recommend Thrash. At a certain point, this is going to be like a very small period of time, but at a certain point, when you still need to have a skill on your bar that is a basic skill for vigor generation, and you are still using the Eagle Spirit Hull, again, we'll talk more about this in a second, during this period of time, you will want to use Rock Splitter. The reason that you want to use Rock Splitter is not because it's necessarily that great of a basic skill, but it's because you end up getting this legendary, which is absolutely broken, which we'll talk about later, but anytime you cast a Gorilla skill, it increases your weapon damage. The second that you gain access to this, you want to swap your basic skill so that you have permanent uptime on this buff, and you just press Rock Splitter every 3 seconds, because this buff, in addition to scaling armor, is disgustingly overpowered, and I'll talk about that. But up until that point, I would recommend just playing with Thrash. Then we go Quill Volley, Enhanced Quill Volley, and Advantageous Quill Volley. And then we'll just put 1 extra point into Sharp Thrash so we get that extra ferocity. I'm just looking at my leveling path here, so feel free to check that out. Also, a lot of the points, like, you have so many skill points now. You have 71, and a lot of it is really preferential with just passives. So if you need survivability or you need more damage, you can go in whatever order you prefer. But early on, I would recommend grabbing these skills in the order that I grabbed them. Next, we're going to go for Soar. Soar is really nice to just have while leveling. Eventually, we end up taking it out of the build, but it's just basically kind of like Teleport, and it just is really nice to use. Just great for mobility. So I'm just grabbing the 1 point there for the mobility. Second point will just give you increased movement speed after using it as well, which we will get, so feel free to pick that up whenever you want. And then we go into Ravager. Ravager is disgustingly crazy. Let's talk about that real quick. Passively, it'll just give you 2 stacks of ferocity at all times. And then when you activate it, it's going to cause your attacks to just deal straight up extra weapon damage for every single attack that you deal. Additionally, we're going to level up our Quill Volley with the rest of our points. And we'll grab these bonuses for Ravager here. Additionally, Ravager has this awesome thing where the duration is extended by 2 seconds per kill. So you can just have this up 100% of the time, even if you don't have like any cooldown reduction. As long as you're getting kills, you're going to have this up all the time. It won't be active on bosses all the time, but that's perfectly fine. And it also has this insane thing where while it's active, your core skills instantly dash to your target and increases your vigor generation by 30%, which is really nice for both reasons. The dash is super, super fun. As you can see, like if I just press Quill Volley or even just Thrash, it's going to dash me to the target. It says it's only supposed to do it with core skills, but it does it with all skills. I'll just grab the points into Ravager. So Ravager has this thing where while it's active, right, you get all this extra damage, just free crazy amounts of damage, and it is always giving you that passive. But while it's active, any kill that you get is going to extend the duration. So without any cooldown reduction, pretty much you can have this with 100% uptime other than on bosses. Really good. And then it also has this really fun mechanic where while it's active, your core skills instantly dash to your target, and all of your vigor generation is increased by 30%. The dash is super nice, really good for mobility, just all around fun, but the 30% vigor generation and the fact that this just gives you a straight up damage buff means that I think for almost every build relating to weapon damage, you pretty much always play Ravager. There isn't really much else that is going to give you as much power as this. The dash is really fun, so as you can see, by default, if I just press my Quill Volley, I'm not going to dash, but if I activate Ravager, and then I press my Quill Volley, I actually dash to the target, which is really, really nice for just generally playing the game, and it makes just playing really fun and super fast-paced. Because Ravager is just going to straight up add damage to our attacks, we want to full level it because that just gives us straight up a whole bunch of extra damage. And then we're going to go into Armored Hide. You could probably go into Armored Hide, actually, I'll probably have this in the leveling path. Just follow the leveling path that I have on the website. Armored Hide is great because passively you gain 1 resolve stack every 5 seconds. What resolve does is going to increase your damage reduction by 20% while it's active, and then if you take any damage, it's going to consume a stack of the resolve, and by default you can hold up to 8 stacks. It's very similar to Fortified, but As long as you have any stacks of resolve, you're just going to get that damage reduction, and you can't like instantly lose all your resolve stacks if you get hit a lot. It's kind of has like an internal cooldown of how many you can lose. So simply just by having Armored Hide on our bar, we basically gain access to 20% damage reduction almost all the time, simply just by having it there. It also counts as a gorilla skill, and anytime that we activate it, it's going to give us unstoppable and give us 100% block. We care about this block for things later on into the build when scaling our damage. But early on for leveling, you pair the passive resolve generation with activating Armor Hide. It gives you maximum resolve, and as long as you press it every once in a while, you'll pretty much always have a resolve stack, which is just 20% DR, which ends up being really, really good. Later on, we'll also go into Perseverance to just get 1.5% extra DR per stack. So if we're at 8 stacks, that's pretty much just 11% DR, which is real nice to grab there. At this point, I'm going to go into Enhanced Soar, and then I went into 3 points into Vigorous. Early on, our resources don't feel that great, so I quite like getting the extra Vigor generation there. Alternatively, if you just want more damage, you could go into Apex for just increased vulnerable damage. Now we have access to our ultimate. Having an ultimate on your bar is extremely good. While leveling, I would recommend going with the Seeker because it has 3 charges on it. Later on, you end up playing the Hunter, and it has a lot of cooldown reduction inherent to it. But while leveling, the Seeker is great because we want an ultimate early on to gain access to 2 passives. First of all, being Resolution. Anytime you cast an ult skill, you gain 15% increased damage to elites, but you double the bonus if you're fighting only one enemy. So if you're fighting bosses, that's a 30% damage increase. Then you gain Supremacy, where any kill while an ultimate is active is going to give you a stack, increasing your damage up to a total of 30%. So very regularly, you can have a 30% damage increase from both of these passives together, so 60% damage increase. And the benefit of Seeker versus the other ult is that it has 3 charges. So if you're going into a pack of mobs, you could throw down one Seeker, have it up for 5 seconds, and then 7 or 10 seconds later, throw down another one and gain access to the buffs for a longer duration. The Hunter does have some pretty nice benefits. One of them is that you get 100% increased damage to injured enemies, so it's really good for ad clearing. It gives you 4 extra stacks of ferocity, so it'll give you a ton of attack speed. Early on, you can't really benefit from the attack speed too much because you don't have a lot of vigor generation, but you also get the chance to instantly reset the cooldown. Later on, you do play the Hunter, but while leveling, having multiple charges of the Seeker is kind of nice. But once you spend all the 3 charges, then having the 3rd charge doesn't really do anything anymore, so definitely feel free to play with the Hunter if you prefer. The Seeker also just does kind of pretty insane damage, which is really nice. You get this little benefit here where the second hit that it does is a guaranteed crit, which is always 300% weapon damage, which is pretty nice. And then we gain access to our key passive here. For our key passive, we're going to be going into Vital Strikes. The reason for this is that it's going to give us a 45% damage multiplier against vulnerable enemies, and if you hit an enemy that's vulnerable, it is going to heal you, generate 5 vigor, and as you can see, it has the removes the vulnerable effect, which actually feels pretty miserable if you're just trying to constantly reapply vulnerable with either the Quill Volley application there or some other sort of application like Soar. But what we're doing with the build, and what I'd recommend trying to get as early as possible, is getting Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch makes it to where you just have a lucky hit chance to curse an enemy, and that's going to put this little curse over their head. I'll show you guys real quick. Put the little curse over their head. And with Vital Strikes on and Vampiric Touch, because the curse is perpetually applying vulnerable and we're not getting rid of the curse, vulnerable never gets removed via Vital Strike, so we permanently have the 45% damage increase there. But also, every time we hit that guy, it's going to heal us, and it's going to give us 5 vigor back. And when you're in a massive AoE pack and everything has the curse on it, and every time you hit them, you get 5 vigor back, it's extremely good for your vigor generation. So early on into the build, until you can get some stuff that gives you more vigor and helps out with your resource, this is pretty much going to carry your resource. But it's also a 45% damage multiplier, just using the one legendary, which is pretty good. We mainly are using it for resource though, and later on we do swap our key passive, but for leveling, this is definitely what you want to go for. Just keep in mind that this is pretty bad without a cursed touch, so if you don't have a cursed touch yet, I would recommend just going adaptive stances for the movement speed, or you could go for Prodigy's Tempo. Prodigy's Tempo is not nearly as good, it's basically just a little bit of cooldown reduction. This ends up being disgustingly broken later into the game though, which I'll talk about. At this point, you should have access to your Spirit Hall. I would recommend going and getting your Spirit Hall as soon as humanly possible. For the primary Spirit, Jaguar used to be insane. They nerfed it, and they nerfed it a little bit too much, so hopefully they buff it by the time the game is actually out, and it is a sizable damage increase. But for leveling, early on, highly recommend going for Eagle. Eagle basically makes it to where anytime you cast an Eagle skill, you gain Storm Feathers. So I'll show you here on my buff bar. I get these Storm Feather movement speed bonus here, which goes up to 20% movement speed, which is pretty insane and just lasts forever. And as long as you're just pressing eagle skills, which you are doing because that is what quill volley is, you are getting that movement speed. And then anytime that you evade, you're going to shoot out these storm feathers, which do crazy amounts of damage. By default, it does 125% weapon damage, and if you compare that to quill volley only doing 36%, that's very good. So that is why you care about having some sort of evade synergy early on. Namely, I would just look out for boots that have attacks reduce evade cooldown on them, and as you're playing, you just want to mix into your gameplay, pressing evade every once in a while, because it just does extra damage with the storm feathers, and you get a lot of movement speed. Later on into the build, you end up wanting to swap over to Gorilla. The reason for this is it's going to make your quill volley count as a Gorilla skill, which is imperative so that we can have permanent uptime on the Unyielding Hits legendary for the additional weapon damage there. And you also gain access to a 30% barrier all the time, which is very, very good for survivability. When it comes to our secondary Spirit Hall, only two options in my opinion. You don't really need the healing from Centipede, nor are we applying poison to anything. The Eagle one is criminally undertuned and I think needs to be reworked in my opinion. So you have Jaguar or Gorilla. Gorilla is nice for giving you permanent unstoppable and also gives you 2 more resolve stacks, but 2 more resolve stacks, you're not really getting much value out of that. So you'd only go this if you really want unstoppable for some reason. So for us, we're going to be going with Jaguar. This just makes it to where we gain access to ferocity stacks pretty much all the time. Anytime we hit a boss or anytime we just kill an enemy, we get ferocity stacks. By default, this is going to cap out at 4. There is a legendary we can use that actually increases our maximum ferocity stacks by up to 5, so then we just get a crazy amount of attack speed from that. It's not like insane power or anything, but attack speed is pretty nice. As you can tell though, we just have a ridiculous amount of skill points left, so we're just going to go into a ton of passives that really just increase our damage overall. First of all, I'm going to go into Brilliance and then Acceleration, just because I really like having movement speed for leveling, and this is another little benefit that you get out of evading. Your next Eagle skill is also going to deal increased damage, so one thing you can do is you can evade, and then you can pop down your ultimate. Here, I forgot to put the point in there. You don't really need this if you have the curse, but it's nice vulnerable application. But you can evade and then pop down your Eagle, and then it'll do 30% increased damage, which is pretty nice. And then based on your movement speed, you get extra damage with Brilliance too, which is quite strong. Might as well just grab that while we're here, and then I'm going to go into Apex. At this point, we're just grabbing like a ton of passes that increase our damage. So Apex is nice, just increase damage to vulnerable enemies, and everything is pretty much vulnerable. And then you can decide here whether or not you want to go for more damage or you want to go for more survivability. I'll just grab some survivability stuff to show you guys. So like 15% damage reduction from vulnerable enemies is pretty nice. And then you can go into the damage reduction while you have stacks of resolve, which you're pretty much always going to have from Armored Hide. Fueled is really nice, especially if you're using the Jaguar Spirit Hall passive. You just get a ton of life on kill. 15% life on kill is very, very good. And you can actually pair this with the Starlight aspect, where anytime you heal, you get some primary resource. So that's super good early on if you happen to get that aspect. Next to that, getting Potent is quite nice. You just get a ton of damage out of Potent, which is one of the main benefits. Not main, but it's a good benefit of using Ravager, because you're constantly hitting enemies with something that is technically a Jaguar skill. So you're gaining access to Potent, which is hitting enemies with a Jaguar skill, increases the damage they take from you. And this will actually stack up pretty quickly because Ravager does multiple hits a second, so that's really nice. And then we can go into Mirage. This is just 15% crit chance. Nothing really crazy there. And then because we are using a Gorilla basic skill, once you gain access to the Legendary, which you should be using, you'll get 15% increased max HP after you just cast a Gorilla skill, and that ends up being pretty good. And then right now this is bugged, but Anti-Venom should be giving poison resistance. Right now it isn't, but early on while leveling you care about resistances, right? So this will just knock out one of your resistances for you pretty much by itself. So I would just put multiple points into that, and then we have 4 points left over. You could have done this earlier, but at this point I'm just going to max out the Seeker. You can actually level ultimates now, which is going to not only increase its damage, but also reduce the cooldown. You could do that earlier if you wanted. If you don't feel like you need survivability, instead of going into Resilient or instead of going into the Poison Res, earlier on you could level up the Seeker just so you have more uptime on these damage buffs, and it'll make it just do significantly more damage, which is pretty nice too. Let's talk about legendaries and gear, because based on what access you have to certain legendaries will kind of influence some of the things that you change in the skill tree and when you actually are able to swap certain skills. The first thing that you absolutely need, and that I would highly recommend going out of your way to get early on, you don't need to get it like early, but when you're in Nahantu, there's a dungeon once you have it unlocked that will just give you this aspect, and then you just want to slam it on an amulet. Already talked about it earlier on, but it just makes Quill Volley do significantly more damage. Next to that, a Cursed Touch is very good for not only the Vigor generation, but also the 45% increase in multi via Vital Strikes. This early on will kind of just carry your Vigor gen. Otherwise, you'll be having to press your basic skill a lot, which isn't that big of a deal. but early on, this is pretty nice. If you're unable to get this, Starlight Aspect is decent for Vigor generation as long as you have some form of healing. The only healing we'll really get is going to be with Fueled, so maybe there's some other sort of healing that you might have, like from Life on Hit on Gear or something like that, but otherwise, that's pretty much your only healing. When it comes to damage aspects, there's a few that are unbelievably gross, and or like two namely that are extremely strong. The first one is going to be Unyielding Hits. Casting a Gorilla skill increases your weapon damage by 30% of your armor for 3 seconds. The reason that this is insane is that everything that you do in this game scales off of your weapon damage. My weapon damage currently is only 151, but as you can see, this is going to give me 30% of my armor. And I have currently, I don't even have that insane of gear, like relative to my level. I have pretty under leveled gear. And I tried to make sure not to smurf myself because I wanted to get like realistic gameplay. And I've leveled up multiple times, so I wanted to have it be kind of accurate. But anyways, you can see that I get to 1000 armor. This is only on a ring, by the way. This isn't on a two-hander or an amulet. So I'm getting 300 extra weapon damage from this, which is double the value of my current weapon. So as a result of using this, I'm getting triple damage. So I'll show you guys on my tooltip. So you can see that my tooltip right now, 36% weapon damage. And then the second that I cast a Gorilla skill, boom, that goes up to 671. And that's with me missing about 400 armor from Disobedience not being stacked up. So this basically just turns scaling armor into a damage multiplier, and you want armor anyways, but you could get armor on every single piece of gear right now. You can get it on helmet, chest, gloves, boots, and pants, and you can get percent armor on amulets. I have a 74% total armor greater affix amulet on my other character, and it's just completely insane. So once you gain access to this is probably when I would swap off of Eagle. There's two things that you could do. If you don't like the damage that Eagle is doing, you could swap off to from Eagle to Gorilla, or you could just swap your basic skill from Thrash into Rock Splitter. Personally, what I'm going to do is the Eagle thing is actually pretty good early on. The third benefit for Rock Splitter isn't that important, by the way, because you're not really attacking with it that much, so you could spend the skill point elsewhere. But personally, what I'm going to do is up until around level 60, I'm going to play with the Eagle thing because the movement speed is really good and the feathers actually do decent damage. But once you get into around like the higher difficulties like Expert, Penitent, the amount of damage that Eagle is going to do is going to fall off, and you're not going to need this movement speed anymore, and rather you're going to need survivability. So at that point, I would go into Gorilla, and then I would probably transition off of a basic skill once I gain access to this ring, which I would highly recommend looking out for. And I'll show you guys my Vigor generation with this ring. Definitely look out for this early because you can basically remove a Cursed Touch the second that you get this. Anytime you crit, you're going to regain 44% of the Vigor that you spent in the last 2 seconds. So I'll just show you guys my Vigor generation without the ring. It's not going to be anything insane. It's like good enough to play with for sure, especially with a Cursed Touch. I'll just attack here, and you can see with the Cursed Touch, like I'm getting pretty good resource back. Actually a very good resource, surprisingly. I think it's mainly because of the Cursed Touch, but like if I just AFK and hold down right click, I don't press any of my abilities, I will nearly run out of resource, right? But if I happen to throw this on, you just replace a Cursed Touch with this, throw this on, and just hold down right click, you can see my Vigor is completely insane. This ring by itself will 100% carry your Vigor generation to where you never have to worry about it pretty much ever again, and a ton of builds are going to be using this. So the second that you gain access to this ring, you can actually just take off of basic skill entirely. And it depends where you're at in the build process, what you want to put on. Eventually, I would recommend, we ended up going with Counterattack. So I would go with Counterattack, or I would go with Scourge and Enhanced Scourge. There will be multiple versions of the build in the description, ones with uniques, ones without uniques, etc. So feel free to just reference that if you're a little bit confused at this point. But if you get this, just slam it on and it'll completely carry you, and you don't really need to use a basic skill anymore. And at that point is when I'd recommend swapping over to the Gorilla thing so that your Quill Volley counts as Gorilla skill, so that you're gaining access to this legendary, which is just completely disgusting. The legendaries and gearing related things worth mentioning are, because this is so good, getting Disobedience is really nice just to scale it. This aspect is a utility aspect, so it can go on chest, helm, gloves, pants, and boots. So putting it on boots is pretty decent if you want a damage increase there. This aspect is extremely good in tandem with another one, which I will mention in my video going over a lot of Spiritborn mechanics, but this one gives you block chance per resolve stack. The reason that that is very good is because there's an aspect that gives you crit damage based on your resolve. If I type crit here, I forget what it's called, this one. You gain increased crit damage based on your block chance. So what you can do is you can get a crazy amount of resolve stacks and then with that aspect, convert all of that resolve to block, and then it actually goes over the 100% cap of block, and then you can just scale your crit damage out of the world. The reason you don't use this for leveling is because, first of all, you don't have any crit damage really to scale, and second of all, your crit chance is really low, so going out of your way to scale this isn't great. I might have it in the planner anyways, but early on for leveling, this is not great. But once you get some crit and some crit chance, then it ends up being really good. So like I was saying, once you gain access to this unique and you don't really have vigor problems as much anymore, I would recommend putting it on first and seeing if you have issues still or not. But you could swap off of a Cursed Touch in theory, which is what I end up doing in my endgame build. Swap off of a Cursed Touch, and then because you don't have to play with a Cursed Touch anymore, you could swap that to a different damage aspect or something, and then you don't need Vital Strikes anymore to carry your vigor. Vital Strikes is a pretty decent damage increase, like I was saying, but Prodigy's tempo is unbelievably insane, and I want to demonstrate that real quick. Adaptive Stances was pretty decent. You get like movement speed all the time, which is okay, and the increased core stats is like a decent damage increase. It was kind of bugged for me. It wasn't working for me in the pit. It would give me the buff for a little bit, and then it would go away, and then it would never come back. But increasing your dexterity by 50% is a decent bonus. But Prodigy's tempo is just insane. Basically, every third consecutive cast of the same skill, being Quill Volley, is going to reduce the cooldown of all of your skills by 10%, and that's going to be increased by a further 2% for each of their skill ranks. So, for example, in the case of our ultimate being the Seeker, or any other ultimate that you want, because we put 5 ranks into it, it's going to be reduced by 20% of its cooldown per third cast. So if we have a lot of attack speed and we're doing like multiple attacks per second, you can, in theory, which I do in my endgame build, infinitely just reduce the cooldown of all of your skills, which is disgustingly insane. You can gain stuff like permanent 100% block chance and max resolve stacks and unstoppable with Armored Hide. You can gain 100% dodge chance with counterattack up all the time. You can gain permanent 50% increased damage against crowd-controlled enemies by just spamming Scourge, and that giving you extra maximum vigor generation. Like, there's a lot that you can do by just having access to a lot of cooldowns, and one of the good things is with the ult, you can, if you're using like the Hunter for example, you always get 4 extra stacks of Ferocity, always get 100% increased damage to injured enemies, and you're always gaining access to Resolution and Supremacy. So real quick, I just want to demonstrate that. So just look at my Seeker, just look at all of my cooldowns actually on the bar there. So I'm just going to put everything on cooldown, and then I'm just going to hold down right click, and you can see my cooldown's constantly getting refreshed, and that is with very low attack speed and like the build not being set up like, you know, this is a leveling build, right? My character has like level 45 weapon on. Like everything that my character has is very scuffed, and this is super early on, and look at my cooldowns. Like, it's insane. I can just spam everything. So eventually that is what you want to swap to. Other honorable mentions for uniques, etc. that you want to be looking out for. There's a lot of really good vigor ones. Wound Drinker is pretty insane. Anytime you deal thorns damage, you gain straight up vigor. The reason that that's pretty good is if you're using Gorilla, anytime you use a skill, it's going to deal thorns damage, and this is going to give you vigor per enemy hit. So if you have 5 mobs, 7 times 5, that's 35 vigor every single time that you are attacking. And I think it also works with Ravager potentially. Not 100% sure. But you could be gaining 14 vigor per attack as a result of using that. Another decent one is Ring of Midday Hunt. Anytime you kill an enemy, you just get 7 vigor, so that is decent. The maximum vigor isn't going to help you that much while leveling, though. Another one that's okay is Band of the First Breath. Anytime that you evade, it's going to consume a resolve stack to give you a little bit of vigor. This one is much weaker than the other ones, but it does have a decent damage increase on it. Very, very early on leveling sort of thing. Real quick, I just want to demonstrate the cooldown reduction on kind of a maxed out character. So this is only using the passive, and look at my cooldowns. Like I can be in, I can have my cooldowns up literally 100% of the time. I also want to show you guys some other uniques you should be looking out for. One of them is Harmony of Ebawaka. Basically, this makes it to where your skills based on your Spirit Hull are going to give you increased damage, and also your passive Spirit Hull will make your skills count as other skills. So because I have Jaguar passive and Gorilla main, my Quill Volley counts as Eagle, Jaguar, and Gorilla, and this is going to increase my damage by 30% per spirit type, so that is just going to be 90% increased damage, which is disgustingly strong. It also has pretty decent stats on it. Another unique, which I end up using in the endgame build, is Rod of Kapelike. This is really good. You just scale your max resource and increases your damage as a result of scaling your max resource, and it also makes your Quill Volley count as a basic skill as well as a core skill. Which is really nice for cooldown reduction is Jackinth's Shell. If for whatever reason you didn't want to use Prodigy's Tempo, or you weren't using a core skill or potency skill, Jackinth's Shell basically does the same thing, where every second is going to drain your cooldowns. So I'll kind of just show you guys what that looks like. If I take off Prodigy's Tempo, I'll just put on something random there, and I'll put on Jock and Shell. You get a crazy amount of cooldown reduction with this. It does come at the cost of costing life for you, and every time that you spend Vigor, it's going to give you HP. But per cooldown, like if I don't attack at all, it's going to drain my HP, and then if I attack, by spending Vigor, I am therefore healing myself. That has a pretty good synergy with Starlight Aspect, which we'll talk about in a separate video, but quickly just wanted to show you guys that. When it comes to like what you want on your gear while leveling up, it's pretty generic what you want for every other character. Getting any sort of like additive damage is pretty good. So, you know, vulnerable damage is quite nice because stuff is vulnerable all the time. Dexterity is always really strong. When it comes to a weapon you want, I'd recommend going for a quarterstaff because it's going to have a 1.1 attack speed where the other ones are at 0.9. And eventually, the quarterstaff has block chance on it, so you can scale up the redirected force aspect. I don't have any gear with it on me right now, but for tempering, I would recommend tempering offensively. Go for vulnerable damage or eagle skill damage. Those are probably your best bet. On the weapon, you could temper quill volley chance for projectiles, but early on, vulnerable damage is probably just more damage. And then you could temper on armor. Try to max out your resistances while leveling. That's always a good thing to do. My resistances are scuffed currently on this character, but that's fine. Torment 4 regardless. Otherwise, you can temper like armor to scale up the this aspect here. Get just a ton of armor, scale that up. Ranks of core skills is always good. Max HP is always good. Pretty much like all the generic stuff. Again, it'll be in the build link what I'd recommend on each piece of gear. What's good for all characters leveling is going to be good for Spiritborn, just getting a lot of generic damage. Max HP, Dex, that sort of thing. When it comes to leveling up, I'd recommend using Subo a lot of the time. Rahir is also good. Rahir will give you armor as well as some damage reduction or additional damage depending on how you spec it. Subo I quite like because you get 20% movement speed a lot of the time after hitting an elite, which is pretty nice. I forget, Valera will also give you some movement speed, but Subo just has the benefit of it shows all the mobs on your map, and it also shows a lot of ore and herb nodes around, so I just like having him on. You also get 25% increased crit damage to enemies hit by his little cover fire ability. The Mercenaries aren't particularly strong, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. One thing I want to mention is that the seasonal mechanic is not in the version of the game that I'm playing, so any seasonal mechanic related thing, I will just have to put in the build link because I have no freaking idea right now. But once we know what's good, I'll just slam it into the build link and you guys can just follow that. That's pretty much it for the build. If you guys have any questions, leave it down in the comments. I'll make an FAQ on the build link. And feel free to just swing by my Twitch channel if you have any questions. Just ask me while I'm playing. If anything changes about the build, I will let you know on Twitch and you can just watch me play with the build at that time. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching and I will see you guys later. Peace.